the smallest state geographically in the South. South Carolina may seem like a relatively unimportant area today, but in the colonial period it formed the most complex linguistic area in British North America, with languages from 3 continents in intimate contact. Within its first half century, there were speakers of French, Portuguese, German, Scots, and other European languages, and several varieties of English, including probably 2 or 3 Caribbean varieties. Now, the number of African languages brought to South Carolina in colonial days, we can only guess. Moreover, South Carolina was the seedbed of the development, the spread of Southern English more broadly. Much of the lower South was settled from the South Carolina low country, and the upper South from the South Carolina upcountry. What varieties of English were in contact in South Carolina during my crucial century? To answer this question with any degree of certainty with respect to linguistic patterns that the early groups would have brought, one must have documents. To illustrate the heterogeneity of English in early South Carolina, I examined variation between was and were, past tense forms of the copular auxiliary verb, in 3 sets of documents written by whites born in the 18th century. A sample from each of these, a sample document from each of these sources is in the appendix on the handout. Now, the first page of the handout shows, everyone have a handout? There are some extra copies up on the table here. The first page of the handout has a map with the location of the 3 writers here. There's George Dalton over in the west, in Silver Bluff, South Carolina, Catherine McCormick Smith in Willow Springs over in the east and the coast, and Hugh McCauley, who is in the Petey River, just a county or 2 up from Catherine Smith. Now, the language, the first of these writers, George Dalton, I examined 16 letters written between 1750 and 1778. George Dalton immigrated from North County, Armagh in the late 1730s. Soon thereafter, he obtained a license from Charlestown officials to trade with the Creeks, Cherokee, and Choctaw to the west. And by around 1750, he had located at Silver Bluff on the Savannah River and established his own trade. This part of South Carolina was a very rough and tumble place at that time, as evidenced by a report in the August 7th, 1767 issue of Charlestown's South Carolina Gazette. This is number 2 in the handout. Letters from Silver Bluff on Savannah River, dated on Tuesday last week, inform us that a number of people called crackers, and this actually is a term that came from Ireland, from Ulster originally, and now, of course, is applied to rural whites, particularly in Georgia and Florida. A number of the people called crackers who live above Augusta in the province of Georgia had gone in a hostile manner to the Indian town and settlement in Oconee, where on their arrival, finding only an old Indian man, all the others being out hunting, they plundered the village of everything of any value that they could carry off, and then burnt every house in it. This is the kind of area that George Dalton and many of his fellow Indian traders were working in at that time. Now, the patterning of Dalton's was-were variation I give in Table 1 and number 3 on the handout, and a number of sample sentences are in number 4. So, for instance, we have 4B here, and you can see from his rather idiosyncratic spelling how useful these documents are for mining for linguistic purposes, we certainly were the aggressors in the beginning. There is a use of were in the first person plural, and in the third person plural. The only place in the paradigm that Dolphin uses were, otherwise he's categorical for was. Almost the only variation we see in Dolphin's writing is in the first person plural and in the third person plural. There is a single case in 4E that occurs with the collective plural, Congress were. But otherwise we find a perfect correlation with whether the subject is the pronoun they, or actually we, or something else. This shows almost complete conformity to the familiar northern present tense rule for the British Isles that's been frequently documented there and in several varieties of American English. And with Dolphin's background from Ulster, this is exactly what we would expect to find. Lots of were after pronouns in the plural. The second source is a single document, a testament from an elderly woman in coastal South Carolina, dated 1850. This is in the Appendix 2, the complete document in the handout. Dating 1850 from Little Springs, a small rural community in Horry County at the other end of South Carolina from Silver Bluff. It presents quite a contrast to Dolphin's English. This is the testament of Catherine McCormick Smith, an apparently illiterate 84-year-old woman who dictated it to her friend, a Mrs. Macklin. Rich in phonetic spelling and colloquial grammar, the document reveals much of what must have been the common speech of that part of South Carolina roughly 2 centuries ago. Depending on the age of Macklin, that is, Miss Amanuensis. Among other things, we find variation in the present tense cognitive between be and is, and I've given you in 5 on the handout a couple of examples of that. We have I be Catherine Smith. This is a feature that Margaret Michaud and I discussed in a paper in American Speech 4 or 5 years ago, if you want to look up further details. But with regard to Catherine Smith or Mrs. Macklin, nothing definite is known about their ancestry, how long their families had lived in South Carolina, or actually where those families had come from. The circumstantial linguistic evidence suggests the southern half of England, because of the prevalence of singular were in this particular document. According to the Survey of English Dialects and the Linguistic Atlas of England, singular were occurs in parts of the South and Midlands of English. So in number 6 in the handout, table 2, we can see that was is a minority form throughout the paradigm. Only 2 of 7 cases we have was in first person singular, for instance. And an example of that would be 7A. Now I was born in McCormick. We have was there, but in the next in 7B we have I were of the mind that I were blessed with him, like Abraham for that Bible. So actually were, or usually spelled W-A-R-E, is the dominant form throughout the paradigm for this particular writer. With only one context in the plural, we can't examine this document for operation of the northern present tense rule and make a comparison to Dolphin's letters. But in the Smith Testament, a singular, in singular context, were or war is the majority form for both first and third persons.